The house on Ashford Hill.
Students.
The first time anyone in Salem whispered the name Fairfax after dark, they lowered their voice as though afraid the family might somehow hear them through the wind. For generations, Salem had learned to live with its shadows, the infamous witch trials, the sudden silences of drowned sailors, the way fog rolled off the harbor like a second skin. But the Fairfaxes brought with them a new darkness, one stitched not from superstition but from something deliberate, patient and cruel. And yet, when they first arrived in 1811, the townspeople welcomed them with open arms. They were, after all, everything Salem's ambitious leaders prayed for: wealthy, refined, and seemingly determined to transform the community into a beacon of culture. No one knew then how much blood would be spilled to fuel that transformation. No one knew the house on Ashford Hill would become a place the town itself tried to forget. Even now, more than 200 years later, the soil around that foundation is said to rot quicker than anywhere else in Essex County. And if you press your ear to the earth on certain cold nights, locals swear you can still hear the cries of girls who never escaped its walls. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand the Fairfax family, to understand what they built, you have to go back to the day the house first opened its blackened shutters. A town hungry for redemption in 1811, Salem was still nursing wounds it could not show the world. The witch trials had ended more than a century earlier, but shame lingers in soil. People avoided certain street corners, spoke the names of accused women only in whispers, and overcompensated with outward shows of piety. The town craved redemption, an opportunity to reinvent itself as moral, respectable, enlightened. When Victoria Fairfax arrived from Virginia, cloaked in black silk with her pale face and steel-gray eyes, she was the very image of refinement. A widow at 32, she possessed both money and an unnerving kind of charisma. People described her gaze as a measuring thing, as though she could weigh the worth of your soul in the moment her eyes locked on yours. She came with a vision, a school for young ladies, St. Mary's Academy, an institution that would, she promised, cultivate virtue, intellect, and moral strength in girls who otherwise had no prospects. Half the students would be daughters of Salem's elite, the other half orphans and paupers who would pay nothing. Charity on one hand, prestige on the other. A perfect fusion of righteousness and social climbing. The town leadership all but threw the doors open for her. Salem needed someone like Victoria Fairfax. What they didn't realize was that she needed Salem even more. The house itself, the building she chose should have been the first warning. Ashford Hill had always been an uneasy slope overlooking the harbor. The Georgian mansion that stood there had been built by a China trader who died before ever living in it. Families tried to occupy it, briefly. Each fled within months, citing oppressive air, strange knocks in the walls, shadows that didn't belong to any person. By the time Victoria Fairfax arrived, the mansion had been empty for nearly 2 years, windows black with mildew, doors hanging like broken teeth. She purchased it without hesitation. Renovations began immediately. A chapel, wing with imported stained glass depicting saints, dormitories to house 30 girls, meditation rooms on the 3rd floor. At night, townsfolk walking past claimed they saw lights flicker in upper windows, too bright for candles, too erratic for lanterns. But when questioned, Victoria would smile thinly and say, "Spirits are always restless when they sense holy. Work is about to begin." Most people laughed nervously and said nothing more. The family triumvirate Victoria did not arrive alone. She brought with her 2 relatives whose presence would prove just as influential and far more unsettling. Her younger sister Evangeline was fragile, prematurely gray, with hands that trembled even when still. But when she sang hymns, her voice was so beautiful it made sailors pause mid-haul on the docks. People called her the Angel of Ashford Hill. They did not see the way her eyes sometimes glazed as though she were listening to music only she could hear. And then there was Bartholomew, Fairfax, Victoria's brother-in-law. Gaunt, with sunken eyes and a preacher's cadence, Bartholomew thundered about sin from the chapel pulpit, warning of the devil's snares and the vulnerability of young women. Parents clutched their daughters tighter when he spoke, but they also thanked God such a vigilant shepherd would guard them at St. Mary's. Together, the trio presented a fortress of respectability. No one dared to question their intentions. First students, first whispers on September 15, 1811, St. Mary's Academy opened its doors. 23 girls filed in, half privileged, half destitute. To the poor ones, it was salvation, a warm bed, food, and the chance to learn. Among them was a fiery Irish girl named Margaret Sullivan, a quiet, bookish orphan named Priscilla Morse, and hollow-cheeked Hannah Whitmore, abandoned after her father's imprisonment. At first, all seemed well, but less than a year later, Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a seamstress living at the bottom of Ashford Hill, noticed things that curdled her blood. She delivered cloaks one morning and saw wealthy men slipping from the academy's side entrance, hats pulled low, faces averted. At night she spotted unmarked carriages waiting in the fog, and the girls, their eyes dulled, their movements slow, their skin pale as though drained of something vital. Then came the night of December 13th, 1812. Mrs. Thornton, unable to sleep, stood by her kitchen window when she heard muffled screams from the Academy chapel. Light flickered, torchlight, not candlelight. Shadows writhed on the walls. The cries rose, then abruptly stopped. 3 days later, she learned young Hannah Whitmore had died of sudden fever. Hannah's funeral was quiet. No family attended. Victoria, in black lace, declared it God's will. The girls sang, hymns that quavered with fear more than grief. Hannah was buried behind the academy beneath a simple stone. But that night, Mrs. Thornton swore she saw something that would never let her sleep soundly again. Passing the cemetery at dusk, she glimpsed a figure kneeling by Hannah's grave. It was Margaret Sullivan, her red hair catching the last traces of dying light. The girl looked up, and in her eyes was not grief, but terror. She opened her mouth, as if to call out, then froze, staring at something behind Mrs. Thornton. The seamstress turned. The cemetery was empty, but the air had changed, heavy and pressing, as though the hill itself were watching. The hollowing. The morning after Hannah Whitmore's funeral, Salem carried on as though nothing had happened. Carriages rattled along, cobblestones, church bells chimed, and the harbor's gulls cried their ceaseless complaints. Yet those who passed the academy on Ashford Hill spoke in hushed voices, eyes sliding toward its shuttered windows, then quickly away again. Death was common in 1812. Fevers and accidents claimed lives without ceremony. But there was something about Hannah's passing, sudden, silent, unexamined, that unsettled even the most practical townsfolk. The Fairfaxes, of course, projected unshaken composure. Victoria appeared in chapel the following Sunday dressed in widow's black, declaring that sorrow was a test of faith. Bartholomew thundered that the devil claimed the weak. Evangeline sang so sweetly that tears streaked the cheeks of even the hardest sailors. By the end of the service, doubt seemed almost sinful. Almost. Because some had seen the bruises on Hannah's arms. Some had heard the muffled cries in the chapel. And some, like Mrs. Thornton, had witnessed far more than they dared confess, aloud. The shifting girls inside. The academy. The girls themselves began to change in ways too subtle at first to notice. They grew quieter, their laughter thinning until silence ruled the dormitories. Their appetites waned. Bread lay untouched. Bowls of broth cooled. Margaret Sullivan, once all fire and quick words, now moved like an actress pretending to be herself. Her green eyes darted constantly, searching corners, doorways, shadows. At night she whispered prayers in Irish, not the ones Evangeline taught in the chapel, but old ones, the kind her grandmother had spoken by firelight to keep dark spirits at bay. Priscilla Morse withdrew into books, though even reading seemed to hollow her. She copied passages into the margins in a cramped hand, as though desperate to leave proof of her thoughts before they dissolved into nothing. And others simply stopped speaking at all. When asked, Victoria claimed such transformations were proof of the Academy's moral refinements, that suffering was a natural crucible for the soul. Parents nodded, grateful their daughters were under such vigilant guidance. None noticed that their daughters' hands trembled like Evangeline's. Visitors in the night by late winter, the carriages came more frequently. Always after dark, always up the narrow back road, the townsfolk muttered, but money has its own weather, and the men who arrived at the Academy carried plenty of it. Merchants, legislators, even judges, all cloaked in secrecy. Salem's economy fattened on their coin, and so the whispers went no further than tavern corners. Only Mrs. Thornton kept her vigil. From her cottage window she tracked the silhouettes of men slipping inside, counted the flickering torches in the third-floor windows, pressed her hands together each time a girl's cry broke the night like glass. But she told no one. For who would believe a seamstress against the saintly Fairfax family? Margaret's realization Margaret Sullivan, however, believed. The night after Hannah's funeral she began to notice the pattern, the way special instruction on the third floor always followed the arrival of unmarked carriages. The way girls emerged hours later dazed, lips bitten raw, eyes clouded, as though something inside them had been smothered. She began marking it secretly in her copybook. A line for every carriage, a circle for every girl summoned upstairs, a cross when someone failed to wake the next morning. It did not take long before the page filled like a tally of the damned, the town's blindness. Meanwhile, Salem itself grew proud of its newest institution. Newspapers praised St. Mary's as a beacon of moral progress. Wealthy families boasted of their daughters' acceptance, while poor families offered prayers of gratitude for Fairfax charity. At social gatherings, Victoria dazzled with her knowledge of scripture and European philosophy. Bartholomew roared warnings about modern corruption. Evangeline's voice reduced even cynical men to tears. The Fairfaxes were untouchable, and yet behind lace curtains, more than one mother admitted her daughter had come home pale, thinner, oddly hesitant to speak of life inside the Academy. She is merely being refined, Victoria would explain with a soft smile, purified from her former worldliness. And parents, desperate to believe, nodded. A growing resistance Margaret, though, resisted. She whispered to Priscilla during laundry. Duty nudged frightened younger girls during needlework and gradually pieced together a hidden network of whispers. What they shared was chilling, bitter teas that blurred the mind, ceremonies in candlelit rooms and the ever-present watch of Bartholomew's sunken eyes. One girl described white gowns that felt more like burial shrouds than uniforms. Another remembered men's voices, educated, powerful voices, chanting words she didn't understand. Margaret wrote it all down, not because she expected anyone to believe her, but because she feared her memory would soon be stolen too. On a damp March evening, as the fog rolled off the harbor, Margaret crept to the third floor with a courage born of desperation. She pressed, her ear to the door of a chamber, heard Evangeline's hymn falter into something darker, heard men's laughter mingle with the moans of her classmates. Her stomach clenched, but she forced herself to peer through a crack in the wood. What she saw froze her blood. The girls were not being taught. They were being prepared, arranged like offerings, bodies trembling under candlelight, their faces blank behind the glaze of drugged compliance, and at the center of it all stood Victoria Fairfax, not with Bible in hand, but with a ledger. She marked each girl's name with the cool precision of a merchant tallying stock. When Margaret stumbled back from the door, heart racing, a voice cut the silence behind her. Curiosity, Bartholomew murmured, his gaunt face emerging from the shadows is the first sin of Eve. A teacher in the lion's den by autumn of 1813, the Academy's walls had absorbed so much silence that even footsteps seemed to vanish. Students glided like ghosts, their words clipped, their eyes heavy with the weight of things unspoken. Outsiders described the place as disciplined. Insiders knew it as something else, hollow. That was when Constance Hartwell arrived. 24 years old, she was the daughter of a Boston merchant, educated at Miss Willard's progressive seminary in Troy. She had read Rousseau, Locke, and the radical idea that women could think independently. She came to Salem believing she could spark curiosity in young girls who'd been denied it. She would later say that the moment she stepped into the academy's halls, she felt as though she had entered a tomb disguised as a school. First lessons. Constance's first mathematics class was unnerving. The girls sat with straight backs, faces, blank, answering questions like machines. Their recitations were perfect yet soulless. When Constance posed open-ended problems, ones that demanded reasoning rather than rote memory, she was met with silence so thick she could hear her own pulse. Then, one girl's hand trembled as she wrote on her slate. Her name was Sarah Peaton, 16, once considered a bright scholar. "I'm sorry, Miss Hartwell," she whispered when Constance asked what troubled her. "Sometimes my head feels fogged, like I can't find the numbers I know are there." When Constance asked who told her that, Sarah's eyes darted toward the door. "Dr. Fairfax says it means my spirit is being purified." Constance's skin prickled. Purification by subtraction. The third floor in her second week, Constance discovered the boundaries. While exploring classrooms for a tutoring space, she asked about the locked third floor. Victoria's gaze hardened, steel eyes slicing through her polite tone. "That level is consecrated," Victoria said softly, yet with the authority of a hanging judge. "A place for advanced spiritual instruction. It must not be profaned by mundane lessons," Bartholomew, looming nearby, added. "Some doors, Miss Hartwell, are safer unopened." The message was clear. The third floor was forbidden, which meant, of course, that it was the very place Constance could not stop thinking about. Margaret's approach one November night, wind screaming through the shutters. Constance returned late from the library and noticed movement in the corridor. A girl in a pale gown moving barefoot, her face half hidden by candlelight. It was Margaret Sullivan. She pressed her ear to the side entrance, listening with the urgency of prey near a predator's den. When she turned and saw Constance, both froze. A long, terrible moment passed. Then Margaret whispered, "Miss Hartwell, tomorrow, in class, keep me after, please. I can't speak here." The desperation in her eyes left Constance awake until dawn. The confession. The following day, when the lesson ended and the other students filed out, Margaret stayed behind. Her hands clenched her slate until her knuckles whitened. "They're killing us," she said simply. She spoke of strange teas that left girls dazed, of night ceremonies with candle smoke and men's voices, of classmates who weakened, faltered, and never woke. She showed Constance the tally she had been keeping. Lines, circles, crosses, each marking a carriage, a ceremony, a death. Hannah, Priscilla, Mary Catherine. They didn't die of fever. They were murdered. And soon I will be too. Constance wanted to dismiss it as a child's nightmare, but Margaret's voice was steady, her logic chilling. And when she met the girl's eyes, she saw no hysteria, only the sharp terror of someone who had seen too much. "They think we are lessons," Margaret whispered, "but we are inventory." Forbidden documents. Constance, shaken, began searching Victoria's office during her preparation hours. With Margaret's help, nimble fingers honed by survival in Salem's alleys, she unlocked drawers and found ledgers. The entries were written in codes, but soon their meaning bled through. Each girl was assigned a number. Notes tracked not knowledge, but compliance, resistance levels, suitability, client interest, high, recommend increased dosage, and letters, written in Victoria's elegant hand, addressed to powerful men across New England. Courtesies disguised as donations, promises disguised as progress reports. The realization hit Constance like a stone to the chest. This was not education. This was procurement. Margaret and Constance agreed to move carefully. They needed undeniable proof. They needed allies. They needed time. But time was the one thing they no longer had. One night in February 1814, Constance, hiding near the third floor storage closet, finally glimpsed what Margaret had described. White-gowned girls drugged and swaying. Men seated like spectators, Victoria presiding with ritual precision. She stifled a gasp, pressing her hand to her mouth. And then she heard it, her own name. Victoria's voice, cool and certain, drifted from the chamber. Miss Hartwell may yet serve us. She does not know it, but she is already being prepared. The net tightens. By February of 1814, the air inside St. Mary's Academy had grown so thick with incense and secrecy that even breathing felt like a test of loyalty. Doors that once creaked open now closed swiftly. Conversations ended abruptly when footsteps approached. And always, there was the sensation of being watched. For Constance Hartwell, every day was a performance. She taught mathematics and natural philosophy with calm authority, her voice even, her face pleasant. But beneath her steady tone, her thoughts raced like a hunted deer's. She knew what she had seen in the third-floor chambers. She knew Margaret's tally was true, and she knew the Fairfaxes suspected her. The question was not if they would move against her, but when. The pressure mounts it began subtly. Victoria would linger at the back of Constance's classroom, steel-gray eyes studying her as though weighing every syllable. Bartholomew, once preoccupied with his thunderous sermons, now seemed to appear wherever Constance walked. In corridors, in the chapel, even in the garden where students knelt to pull weeds in silence. His gaze carried the heavy suggestion, "We know." Evangeline remained the most enigmatic. Some days she would pass Constance with a soft, almost pleading look, her lips twitching as if she wanted to speak but dared not. Other days she sang hymns so sweet that the students wept, and Constance wondered if the woman was victim, accomplice, or both. The atmosphere poisoned itself further when Dr. Edmund Fairfax, the coroner cousin, began appearing for health examinations. His hands lingered too long on the girl's wrists, his questions dripping with false concern. He spoke of early signs of fever, of hearts weakened by too much devotion. And each time a girl collapsed days later, he was there to sign the certificate. Constance recorded it all in secret notes, though she knew the walls themselves seemed to have ears. Margaret's desperation. Margaret grew thinner by the week, her hands trembling just as Evangeline's did. Yet her mind remained sharp and her will, though battered, was fierce. "They're dosing the broth now," she whispered one evening while scrubbing laundry beside Constance. "Not just the tea. That's why the fog never leaves us." She showed Constance the inside of her sleeve. The skin was mottled with faint bruises, small and round like the bite of some instrument. "They test us at night," Margaret said flatly. "When we don't wake, they call it fever. When we resist, too long, they make sure we stop resisting." Constance felt nausea coil inside her. "Then we must act quickly. If we wait..." Margaret shook her head. "Quickly is impossible. Quietly is survival. We need proof they can't bury. And we need a voice they can't silence." Her eyes blazed when she added, "And until then, Miss Hartwell, I will keep breathing even if it kills me." Seeds of betrayal. Their alliance was dangerous, and the Fairfaxes knew how to cultivate danger like gardeners of corruption. One evening, Victoria summoned Constance to her office. The room smelled faintly of laudanum and lavender, the walls lined with ledgers Constance now recognized as instruments of death. "Miss Hartwell," Victoria began smoothly, "you've been such an asset. The girls admire you, your lessons impress them. And yet I sense hesitation in your spirit. Perhaps a certain disquiet." Constance forced a polite smile. "Any teacher feels disquiet when her students suffer. They are weaker than when I arrived." Victoria's eyes sharpened. "Weakness is often the soil of virtue. You of all people should understand that suffering shapes character." She leaned forward, her voice lowering to a velvet thread. "I could make you indispensable. Here, greater responsibility, access, authority. All I ask in return is loyalty." It was a poisoned gift. Acceptance would mean complicity. Refusal would mark her as an enemy. Constance chose the only path left. Delay. "Your trust honors me. Allow me time to prove worthy." Victoria smiled, but her gaze lingered like frostbite. The ritual witnessed. The opportunity to strike came on a storm-lashed February night. Margaret slipped Constance a sliver of paper. Tonight. Large gathering. 6 chosen. Constance feigned a headache, retired early, then crept into the 3rd-floor storage closet, heart hammering. Through the grate, she watched as the ritual unfolded. White-gowned, girls shuffled like somnambulists. Candles burned in iron stands. Evangeline played the organ with trembling fingers. Notes curdled into dissonance, and Victoria presided, not with prayer, but with precision. She read from a ledger, calling each girl by number, describing her readiness, her client suitability. Wealthy men sat in chairs encircling the platform, their faces half hidden by shadow but their authority unmistakable. Judges, legislators, men whose names carried power enough to silence entire towns. What followed was not instruction. It was desecration disguised as ceremony. A transaction masked in piety. Constance clutched her notebook, knowing each detail she recorded could mean salvation, or her execution. At last the ritual ended. The men departed through the side entrance. The girls led away like sleepwalkers. Constance exhaled, ready to slip from her hiding place. Then the grate's hinges gave the faintest squeal, her blood iced as Bartholomew's face tilted upward, eyes locking directly with hers through the narrow slats. For a heartbeat, he said nothing, his thin lips curling into something that was not quite a smile. Then, in a voice soft enough for her alone to hear, he whispered, "We were wondering when you would join us." The breaking point. The night after Bartholomew caught her at the grate, Constance Hartwell woke to find a note slid beneath her door. The script was elegant, controlled, unmistakable. "Miss Hartwell, please join me in my office immediately after morning chapel. We have urgent matters to discuss regarding your future here. Signed, Victoria Fairfax." The words looked polite, but Constance felt them like a summons to her own execution. The gathering storm morning chapel was suffocating. The incense was thicker than usual, the hymn slower, more mournful. Victoria read from scripture about obedience to authority, her steel-gray eyes slicing through the rows of girls as if counting them, weighing them. Margaret stood among them, but she swayed as if her body could no longer keep itself upright. Her eyes, once fire-bright even in despair, now looked heavy-lidded, vacant. Yet when they flicked toward Constance for the briefest second, she saw a glimmer. Not defeat, but calculation. Bartholomew's sermon thundered about Eve's curiosity, about women undone by defiance. His words seemed aimed at one person only, and Constance's throat went dry. When the service ended, she made her way to Victoria's office, each step echoing like a drumbeat of doom. The trapped Victoria sat behind her desk, ledger open, quill poised. But on the table before her lay something far more damning. A leather folder containing sketches of the 3rd floor, coded ledger transcriptions, and pages of Constance's own handwriting. Her careful notes, her evidence, laid bare like entrails, on an altar. "Please sit," Victoria said silkily. "We have much to discuss." Constance lowered herself into the chair, every muscle taut. "You thought you were clever," Victoria continued, tapping the folder. "But every word you wrote, every glance exchanged with your little protégé, has been observed. Did you truly believe that a family such as ours could be undone by a schoolteacher and a charity orphan?" Bartholomew entered then, gaunt frame filling the doorway. Behind him came 2 rough men, strangers, their faces hard as stone. And then, worst of all, Margaret was led in. Her hands bound, her green eyes dull. Bartholomew's voice carried smug satisfaction. "She has confessed everything, your plans, your treacheries. She even described your attempts to reach the authorities." Constance's heart plummeted. Margaret, the fierce, unbroken girl, had betrayed her. But then she caught something in Margaret's gaze, a flicker, a tiny, deliberate shake of the head. It was a performance, a gamble, a deception as dangerous as walking a razor's edge. The offer Victoria leaned closer, her presence overwhelming, predatory. "You have two choices, Miss Hartwell. You may join us. Your education, your social connections, your composure, they could be of great use. We have operations in other cities. You could wield real power, not just lecture children on sums and stars, or—" She let the word hang like a blade. "You may refuse, in which case your body will be carried out of this academy before dawn, and your disappearance will be mourned with the proper hymns. Your father will be told you succumbed to fever, respectably, quietly." The men behind Bartholomew shifted, hands on cudgels. Margaret stood silent, her face an unreadable mask. Constance's mind whirled. Acceptance meant complicity. Refusal meant death. There was no third option, or was there? The interruption. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted in the corridor. Shouts, boots pounding against wood. The office door burst open. Uniformed men poured in, Massachusetts State Constabulary, led by a stern-faced officer. Their blue coats were wet with February rain, their muskets gleaming. And at the front of them, unbound, her eyes blazing with a ferocity that cut through her exhaustion, stood Margaret Sullivan. "Victoria Fairfax," the officer declared, voice like thunder. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder." Bartholomew snarled. Victoria's face, so perfectly controlled for years, cracked, revealing fury sharp enough to flay. Evangeline appeared at the door, trembling, her songbird voice breaking into a sob. The academy's illusions were shattering. The wolves were cornered. As the constables forced their way inside, Victoria did not beg, did not plead. Instead, she turned her gaze on Margaret with a look that was not anger, but recognition. "You clever little creature," she whispered, almost admiring. "You've played the game well." And then, her steel-gray eyes flicked toward Constance. "But do you truly think," Victoria said, her voice rising above the chaos, "that exposing us will save you?" For even as the Fairfaxes were seized, Constance noticed the constables' expressions falter. Some of them glanced uneasily at each other, and she realized with a chill that froze her blood, the network was wider than the academy, wider than Salem, and some of the men in uniform had already been bought. Ashes of the academy. The arrests of that storm-lashed night were not the end. They were the beginning of a reckoning so vast it shook Massachusetts to its core. Victoria, Bartholomew, Evangeline, and Dr. Edmund Fairfax were dragged in chains from the academy that had been their theater of corruption. Their students, pale and trembling, were herded out into the rain, clutching one another as though waking from a nightmare. And yet, even in irons, Victoria carried herself like a queen. She did not bow her head, did not break stride. To the very end, she wore her mask of virtue, steel-gray eyes gleaming as if amused that anyone believed chains could bind her spirit. The trial of the century. By autumn of 1814, Salem's courthouse became the stage for a drama the newspapers called the Trial of the Century. Crowds gathered so thick they blocked the cobblestones. Peddlers sold hot cider. Pamphleteers hawked broadsides with lurid headlines. The fallen saints of Beacon Hill. Inside, the testimonies stunned the nation. Margaret Sullivan, frail but unflinching, described the rituals, the poisons, the ledger that had reduced human lives to inventory. Constance Hartwell corroborated with meticulous detail, her voice steady even as her hands trembled beneath the witness stand. Then came Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the seamstress long dismissed as a gossip, her journals filled with years of careful notes, carriages arriving at midnight, hymns twisting into screams, provided the kind of corroboration the defense could not discredit. The prosecution laid out 43 deaths, 43 girls buried under false names and false causes, but the defense was cunning. Victoria claimed she had been misled by her brother-in-law. Bartholomew thundered that he was conducting unconventional but legitimate religious rites. Dr. Edmund waved his medical credentials like a shield, and whispers spread that some judges, some legislators, even some jurors had once been clients of the academy. Justice teetered on a blade. The verdict in the end, it was the documents, the ledgers written in Victoria's own hand, that cut through the lies. On October 29, 1814, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty Bartholomew and Victoria were sentenced to death by hanging. Edmund to 20 years imprisonment. Evangeline, revealed to have been drugged for more than a decade, was declared mentally incompetent and sent to an asylum. On November 15th, before a crowd of more than 2,000, Victoria Fairfax ascended the scaffold. She looked down at the sea of faces, many jeering, some weeping. Her final words chilled even her enemies. "You think you've destroyed us, but rot spreads underground long after the tree is felled. Others will take our place, and when they do, you will call them righteous." The trapdoor fell, the aftermath. The academy was demolished brick by brick, its stones sold to fund reparations for victims' families. A park was planted in its place, a monument erected bearing the names of the 43 lost girls. The inscription read, "They were silenced in life, but not in memory." Margaret Sullivan used her newfound fame not for comfort but for cause. She founded an academy in Boston, one that taught orphan girls not only reading and arithmetic, but independence, law, and the right to question. She lived to see hundreds graduate into lives of strength her own childhood had been denied. Constance Hartwell returned to Boston as well. She married a fellow reformer and devoted her life to oversight of schools, writing pamphlets warning against institutions hidden from public scrutiny. Her words influenced laws that required inspections and protections for vulnerable children across New England, and yet both women carried scars that no applause could soothe. Nights when Margaret would wake screaming, days when Constance would flinch at the sound of church bells, as though they might summon not worship, but ritual. The twist, shadows, remain in the state archives. The seized Fairfax documents were locked away, labeled classified for the public good. Officials feared the scandal would collapse faith in the Commonwealth's institutions if the names of every client became known. Margaret fought for transparency. She wanted the names read aloud in every church, carved into stone, seared into history. But her pleas were denied, and so many of those men walked free. Some resigned in disgrace, others simply relocated, changing names, continuing their careers with little more than a stain on memory. Years later, when Margaret was near death, she confessed to Constance one last chilling discovery. "The ledgers," she whispered. There was another volume, a copy. It was missing when they searched the academy. Constance froze. "You mean—" Margaret's eyes, still bright even in old age, met hers. "They still have it. Somewhere. And as long as it exists, someone, somewhere, is still carrying on the work." The Fairfax family was executed, their empire reduced to rubble, their name cursed. But the shadow they cast stretched further than Salem, further than New England, because evil, once dressed in virtue, does not vanish with a noose. It hides, it adapts, it waits for new hands to don the mask. And if you stand in the park where St. Mary's Academy once stood, locals say you can still hear faint hymns drifting in the night air, notes that twist into screams carried on the wind. Not just a haunting, a warning.